We were now into the early 80s. With 11 films, the James Bond series had long been an established franchise. It had seen its share of lawsuits, we saw 3 different actors portray the lead role, and it suffered the loss of key crew members. First, it was producer Harry Saltzman, who left the franchise after The Man with the Golden Gun. Sadly, the next major player to leave the franchise was Bernard Lee, who passed away in January of 1981 before he could shoot any of his scenes as M. Yes, he was written into the film, but after his death, things had to change. A small comfort was that they didn't have another actor replace the character. According to the film, M is on leave, and temporarily standing in is Chief of Staff Bill Tanner, played by James Villiers. Even though M played a trivial role throughout the majority of the franchise, he was the only actor up until now, aside from Lois Maxwell, who had been in every single James Bond film, and his presence is sorely missed. So in the Bond franchise, we had seen everything from plots of industrial espionage to your classic cat-and-mouse chases. We had our psychopathic criminals who aspired to dominate the world, and we had our more colorful villains who were just fun to watch on screen. The Roger Moore films had seen perhaps the greatest variety, blending elements from the Sean Connery era while trying to mix it up a bit. We went from a drug kingpin to a vengeful mastermind to 2 villains who wanted to completely wipe out human civilization. And eventually we ended up in outer space, which seems to be a tradition with long-running franchises. Can't decide where to set the next sequel? Fuck it, set it in space. With the 12th Bond film underway, the producers wanted to restore it back to its gritty roots. So what we get is an homage to the days of the earlier Bond films. At this point, it seems like most Bond enthusiasts were split between their preference of Bonds. You either got a Cold War thriller, like From Russia with Love or Thunderball, or you got a rock'em sock'em, gadget-induced action film like Moonraker and Goldfinger. And this one was trying to be more along the lines of the Cold War thriller. The film opens and we start off with Bond visiting the gravesite of his beloved wife Tracy, which immediately references the George Lazenby film On Her Majesty's Secret Service. It's pretty sweet because, as we know, Bond isn't exactly the monogamous type, so it shows that all this time he still has feelings for her. I'm sure when he was violating all those women in past films, he was really thinking about her. Yeah, and Timothy Dalton was a good actor. Bond boards a helicopter and within moments loses control. The helicopter does a flyby of a building where we see none other than Ernst Blofeld at the helm. Basically, what they're doing here is picking up the pieces from On Her Majesty's Secret Service, with Blofeld seeking revenge. It even depicts the character as we last saw actor Telly Savalas, neck brace and all. The strange thing here is the film never actually acknowledges that this is Blofeld. Now, we all know who it is, but because of the fact that Kevin McClory owned the rights to Thunderball, EN Productions couldn't actually use the character's name, so they used his likeness instead. Clever bastards. This is probably the most exhilarating sequence in the whole film. Bond eventually regains control of the chopper and picks up Blofeld, dropping him into a tube. Mr. Now, I know it was a legal issue, but I would have loved for this character to return. It was interesting how they were trying to continue past plot threads. Of course, what we get is an adventure that is completely unrelated. There's a spy boat holding a device called an ATAC, an automatic targeting attack communicator, that gets destroyed out in the Ionian Sea. Bond gets sent out to retrieve the device before the Soviets do. So, once again, this is a race between the British and the Soviet governments. Walter Gotell reprises his role as the head of KGB, General Gogol, who sends a contact to Greece to recover the ship. The operative is assassinated, so then Bond gets sent in to investigate the contact's killer. He enters Spain in his Lotus Esprit, which, as I mentioned in my Spy Who Loved Me review, is just flat out awesome. He spies on Gonzalez's villa. Gonzalez was the one responsible for the murder, when he gets caught by hitmen. Gonzalez is then assassinated in his pool while Bond makes his daring escape. I have to hand it to him, he's using his sheer wits as opposed to a barrage of gadgets. We find out that Gonzalez's killer was Melina Havelock, the daughter of Gogol's contact, who was out seeking revenge. They go to escape in Bond's Lotus when they notice it's being tampered with by Gonzalez's goons. Of course, it's booby-trapped and the car self-detonates. Come on, why would you bother trying to mess with a car that looks like that? At the very least, it has to have one hell of a security system. Bond is forced to then escape in Melina's Citroën 2CV. And honestly, this thing is pretty useless. For Christ's sakes, there's a scene where it flips over and Bond has to manually flip it right side up before they can continue their escape. Needless to say, at the end of a really long car chase through the streets of Spain, it gets pretty banged up. But I'll admit, this whole sequence is pretty fun. It's your typical Bond car chase, nothing out of the ordinary and a little long, but well done. Bond goes to Q, who identifies one of the hitmen by inputting some computer code and coming up with an authenticated printout of the guy. Even for the 80s, that's some pretty sophisticated software. They identify the hitman as Emile Leopold Luck, and then Bond goes to Italy to find him. On the ski slopes, Bond meets his contact, Luigi Ferrara, as well as a well-connected informant, Eris Christatos. Christatos asks Bond to escort a student, a young jailbait figure skater named BB Dahl. In town, Bond meets up with Melina, who nearly gets killed by assassins on a motorcycle. He then goes to pick up BB, who literally throws herself at him. Now, you would expect, after 11 movies, that he would just jump into bed with her, no questions asked. I'm sure there's a significant age difference here. It looks and feels so wrong, and yet it's kind of a tradition for Bond to fuck everything that moves.
Everybody knows it builds up muscle tone.
Well, building up a little more muscle tone by putting on your clothes.
But no, to our surprise, he turns down her offer.
Don't you like
This
me?
is kind of comforting because, frankly, I wasn't able to deal with Bond as a pedophile.
I think you're...
Next, James gets pursued by some more henchmen in another really long chase scene. Again, this one's pretty entertaining. It's got bobsleds, some skiing, and men on motorcycles, all chasing each other down the slopes. But here's the problem. What's the story about again? Something about a downed ship? What does this have to do with anything regarding the plot? It's as if they were trying to remake On Her Majesty's Secret Service. At a hockey rink, BB continues her flirting advances towards Bond, and when she leaves, he gets attacked by hockey players. Oh, great, so now we're in the middle of a Kevin Smith movie. What are these, leftovers from Dogma? So Bond goes out to his car and realizes that Luigi is dead. At a nightclub, Bond rendezvous with Christatos and asks how to meet Columbo, who employed Emile near the beginning of the film. I'm losing track here. We find out that Columbo's men are recording Bond's conversation. Columbo ends up having a fight with his date, Countess Lissel von Schloff, and Bond offers to escort her home. And yes, Bond has sex with this one. Of course, Columbo finds out about the affair and kills her in a beach scene that is, again, very reminiscent of the opening scene of On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Bond gets captured by Columbo and reveals that Emile was actually hired by Christatos, and the two of them were working for the KGB in order to retrieve the ATAC. Bond accompanies Columbo to one of Christatos' opium fronts, where they find mines similar to the ones used to blow up the spy ship. A fight breaks out with Bond going after Emile.
You left this with Ferrara, I believe.
Bond and Melina travel to the watery depths to recover the ATAC from the St. George's when they're attacked by a giant back massager. There's another extended action sequence followed by James getting a reception from Christatos, who ties them up and drags them along the sea. They escape, allowing the sharks to eat some of Christatos' men. Christatos gets away with the ATAC, and it looks like our heroes are fresh out of ideas when a parrot, a fucking parrot, clues them into Christatos' location. Traveling to St. Cyril's, Bond repents his sins to Q, then breaks into a monastery. There's a shootout with Bond suspended over a cliff and Columbo covering him from below. Another fight breaks out when Christatos, after trying to assassinate Bond, is killed by Columbo. Gogol comes down to collect the ATAC when Bond throws the device over the cliff. So, great. 2 hours of pointless, unrelated action in which the object everyone's looking for is destroyed anyway.
That's Dayton, comrade. You don't have it. I don't have it.
And then Bond fucks the girl and we go to credits. So, as you can see, this was the direction the Bond series was heading. No matter where they went, they were trying to recapture the spirit of the older films, but they were still favoring big action scenes over plot. Now, the Bond films aren't known for their great plots, but there still needs to be some semblance of a story in between all the great action scenes. The 12th Bond venture, while entertaining for what it's worth, feels disjointed. It has that dreamy On Her Majesty's Secret Service quality to it. Roger Moore portrays the character with an edge of sentiment, much like George Lazenby portrayed the character many years before. It's nice to see the returning characters, namely Miss Moneypenny and Q, and the action scenes, while really drawn out, are still worth the price of admission. But it's pretty forgettable. It has no standout villains, and with the absence of the slick gadgetry that's become a trademark of the series, there are no real highlights to distinguish it from the rest of them. It's not a bad movie, but it's average, so it gets placed near the bottom of the pile.
You're going to pay